Hello, I'm Luciana Spraker with the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives, and I want to welcome you to another virtual Hungry for History program. I'm pleased to have Jamie Credle from the Davenport House Museum join us today to share with us the many achievements and impacts of women in preservation in Savannah's history. I recently attended this presentation when Jamie gave it as part of the Historic Savannah Foundation's Women's History Month programming. I asked her to repeat it so we could share the information with our audience, as not only is it great information, but she has such a fun way of presenting history to us. If you haven't had the pleasure of meeting Jamie before, Jamie is the director of the Davenport House, the only museum property owned by the Historic Savannah Foundation, where she has run operations since 2002. Her previous experience in historic house operations includes Stan Highwit Hall and Gardens in Akron, Ohio, McFadden Ward House in Beaumont, Texas, and Shadows on the Teiche with the National Trust for Historic Preservation in New Iberia, Louisiana, as well as the Cape Fear Museum in Wilmington, North Carolina. She writes regularly on antebellum life in Savannah and is working with Davenport House staff and volunteers on interpretive materials for a new urban slavery exhibit at the property. In 2005, she accepted the Davenport House's Preservation American Presidential Award for Private Preservation from President George W. Bush. And in 2013, she received the Southeastern Museum Conference's Museum Leadership Award. Here in Savannah, she has been a leader among the local museums and cultural institutions, most recently helping us navigate COVID-19 and how to maintain operations and the health and safety of both patrons, staff, and volunteers. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jamie and thank her for coming and joining us today. All right, Jamie, so thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you so much, Luciana. I'm delighted to be here today. This presentation is part of a presentation developed for Women's History Month in March, celebrating women in preservation. And the talk is in two parts. The first part's like a hall of fame of people that I'm aware of who contributed to the preservation of Savannah. And the second part is who can be a preservation leader today, and where do we get inspiration to create new pioneers, new leaders and female leaders in preservation. So it's about 50 minutes long. I'm going to be talking, and I hope that that you'll stay with me the whole time. And just know, Luciana's already introduced me, but I'm the director of the Davenport House Museum, the flagship of Historic Savannah Foundation. But before we delve into the Hall of Fame, there are a few things that I'd like to talk about. First, it's fun to get started with a quote. The history of all times and of today especially teaches women will be forgotten if they forget to think about themselves. So we're going to think about women thinking about themselves and writing the history that may not be there. Another quote that's quite fun is from a female historian, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and this is a very famous quote, and this is, well-behaved women rarely make history. And so we're going to see if Savannah women who we know now were pioneers in preservation were well-behaved or not. And I think one of the points of this presentation is if you know of somebody who's been left out, then you need to make that information known so that we can continue this conversation on women in preservation. And there are two women I want to talk about that are not Savannahans, but have impact on how we see the past and the preservation ethic in Savannah. And the first one is this photographer named Frances Benjamin Johnston. And by the looks of it on the right, she was not a well-behaved woman. She was a pioneer photographer. When photography was new, she acquainted herself with the technology. She got a camera. She set herself up in business. And she was a well-connected Washington, D.C. woman who became the official photographer of the White House in the late 19th century. So as a young person on the right and an older person on the left. And she took the iconic photographs of the late 19th century. So she took photographs of Susan B. Anthony, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Booker T. Washington. At the bottom are photographs of Hampton Institute, which became Hampton University. But in later life, as a mature woman, in the 19 teens and 20s, she became progressively more and more interested in the remaining architecture of early America. And in her 60s, she received a grant from the Carnegie Foundation to document the American South and the landscape that was disappearing. She not only took photographs of the finest homes and important buildings, but of humble structures that revealed the true temper of the times. She was motivated by a desire to document buildings and gardens which were falling into disrepair or were about to be redeveloped. And it's through her lens that we see Savannah of the 1930s. And at the end of her survey in 1938 of Georgia and of Savannah, she gave of her fieldwork of Savannah, particularly, she gave an exhibit of 70 photographs in Savannah, and she gave those photographs to the Tellfair. And for us today, her work is in the publication, The Early Architecture of Georgia, which was published by the Beehive Press in 1957, and it's her photographs that are in these. And again, for us today, if we don't have access to that publication, we can see her photographs through the Library of Congress just by clicking. And we can see photographs of the Davenport House, of Owens Thomas House, of the Green Meldrum House, Wormslow, of the Champion McAlpin Folks House, the Wetter House, but also humble structures such as the ones that you see here. That I hope you've seen before, but if not, just access yourself to them and you can gaze as long as you like over the iconic old buildings of Savannah, including the Oliver Sturgis House, Scarborough House, our streets and lanes. This is Laura's cottage, which is particularly important to us at the Davenport House because Isaiah Davenport was purported to be the builder for this building. The Davenport House we see through Francis Benjamin Johnston's lens. And so we talked about Frances Benjamin Johnston and her lens. We also need to remember Nancy Astor, the Virginia debutante who married Waldorf Astor and became a politician in England. She was grounded, her plane was grounded here in 1946. And so she hailed a cab and wanted to show Waldorf our city. And when asked by a photographer what she thought of our city, she said, "Savannah looks like a beautiful woman with a dirty face." And she said, "Why don't you get a mop and clean her up?" And that both embarrassed and motivated Savannahans to begin to think about the city as a treasure that needed to be cleaned up. So thank Lady Astor and Frances Benjamin Johnston. Now, this is what she was talking about. Two photographs here. On the top is a 1960s photograph of Troop Square before it was rehabilitated and restored. And on the bottom, a photocopy of a photograph of Columbia Square where the Davenport House is. And if you can make it out, there are ruts through the squares because you could drive emergency vehicles right through the center of Columbia Square. So Savannah looks like a beautiful woman with a dirty face. Remember that. So now I want to sort of put in your brains a timeline of women in the preservation movement in Savannah. And just remember that preservationist and how you interpret it, a supporter or advocate of the preservation of something, especially historic buildings and artifacts. So we're going to think about our iconic women, the ones that we know now, and hope that we will find more in the future to celebrate. And we'll see if our Savannah ladies were well behaved. And so the beginnings of our timeline in Savannah will be with Mary Tellfair. Having inherited wealth, she was free to remain unmarried and live a life following her own pursuits. And at the end of her life, she did so much philanthropically, but she's probably best known for having donated her home, her art collection, and her money to the Tellfair Academy of Arts and Sciences, which has become our Tellfair Museums, and a premier art institution in the America, the oldest public art museum in the South, and donated by Mary Tellfair, along with other civic work she did. The Tellfair Museum was one of our beginnings of our preservation movement. Now there was, I work for Historic Savannah Foundation, so lots of times we sort of begin our story in the middle, but there was a lot preservation going on prior to 1955. And I know that you probably can't read all of this that's on the screen here, but things that happened with regard to preservation prior to 1955, there were a number of them. And this research comes from Beth Ryder, our preservationist here in Savannah. And so I'm going to talk about a number of these. Now, what's in green has to do with women primarily. The other things in pink may have involved women, but they may not have been leaders of those things. So we want to think about the National Society of the Colonial Dames in America. Currently, there are 44 corporate societies and over 15,000 members of the colonial dames today, and one must be able to trace one's lineage back to the American colonies before 1776. And the dames today are one of the premier organizations that takes care of historic properties in our nation. And it received the Trustees Emeritus Award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 2000 for its stewardship of historic properties. As for us in Georgia, the National Society of the Colonial Dames in Georgia, they purchased the Andrew Lowe House in 1928 to be their state headquarters. And in 1952, they opened this building to the public. It continues to be one of our premier house museums in the nation and in our state and in Savannah. And that effort in 1928 was led by the president at the time, Mrs. Claremont Anderson. And of course, we're moving forward in time to Alida Harper Folks. She opened a Georgian tea room in the Pink House to guarantee its preservation in 1939. The Savannah Society for the Preservation of Landmarks was formed to save the Pink House. And it was written of Alida Harper Folks that she she completed restoration projects without the advantage of a big bank account, going steadily from one building to another. So she saved the Pink House by making it a tea room, and then she moved on to what became her home, the Champion McAlpin Folks House that she lived in. And then she saved about 10 other buildings and restored them in Savannah, Georgia. Today, the Harper Folks House, or what we call the Harper Folks House, is run by the Coastal Heritage Society as a house museum, which focuses a good deal on Alida Harper Folks and her contribution to the preservation movement. Moving on now to a lady whose name I just love to say over and over, Mrs. Marmaduke Floyd. Dolores Floyd studied library science at Georgetown University, and she returned to Savannah and became a librarian at the Savannah Public Library, particularly with regard to special collections, which were housed in Hodgson Hall, the headquarters of the Georgia Historical Society. In 1943, after she retired as a librarian, she and her husband opened a maritime museum in what was the Pirates House, as you can see here with the gas tanks. behind that belonged to the gas company. She was a bookish sort and knew a great deal about Savannah, which you can read about in this terrific article in September 1968 article about her, Mrs. Marmaduke Floyd, A Triumphant Life. And there's some wonderful things about her and her love for scholarship and preservation. This particular quote jumped out at me. The essence of Savannah was that youth did not bore with its inexperience. Age had the rich flavor of rare old wine. To be 80 was still to be young. At 91, acquired wisdom and commenced to live fully. A woman's city, Savannah, a city of courageous female heretics who defied America's creed and grew old magnificently. And this was sort of directed at how Mrs. Floyd aged, and I think that's fantastic. And I hope that you'll read more about Dolores Floyd, Mrs. Marmaduke Floyd. Another lady whose name I love to say, Stella Henderson. She was an early real estate developer of old properties. And if you look through the squared notebooks, Historic Savannah has a notebook on each square. And the one that I'm looking that's on the screen on the left-hand side is of Green Square, and a page of it before computers. This is what our work looked like, with all different types of writing, with all different colored implements, different Polaroid photographs that showed each lot in Green Square. And this shows the very famous little house there. Mrs. Henderson was known for saving little houses, particularly in the east side of the landmark district. The first house that she saved, though, was not in the landmark district. It became known as the Cottage Shop, a 1799 building south of the landmark district. But she restored many buildings in the district, buying, restoring, and selling them at a time when few people understood the value of downtown Savannah. So on the screen are a couple of her houses that she was known for. One of those was the Dronette House at 536 East State Street. The demolition was saved while the review board found a buyer, and they found Mrs. Floyd, who was willing to buy this property for $1,500, and it cost her $600 to move it from 422 East Hull Street in Crawford Square to 536 East State Street. And of course, there she is with her glasses on her chain in front of the Edward White House, which is an 1812 house. So she saved these little houses, particularly in the east side of the landmark district. And we have now Mary Hillier, and her husband was the president of Savannah Gas Company. The gas company raised 5 of the 6 great gas tanks after going over to piped in natural gas. So you see on the right-hand side what the old fort section looked like with these gas tanks. I have a hard time imagining what it was like living underneath those. But it was her goal to restore a portion of Trustees Gardens to the Trustees Garden Village. It was a real estate development, saving old properties that she, along with her husband and the gas company, were able to achieve. In an article about her, it says, "Woman's vision transforms city." Without waiting on urban renewal money from Washington, Mrs. Hillier began her operation that has transformed the downtown area of this ancient seaport, recovering old architectural beauties that had been hidden for a century. Mrs. Mary Hillier. We have Margaret Thomas, who was also a single woman, similar to Mary Tellfair. And she bequeathed her family home as a memorial to her grandfather, George W. Owens, and her father, James G. Thomas, hence the Owens-Thomas House, our iconic historic landmark, National Historic Landmark today, and a premier historic house museum in our nation, was bequeathed to the Tellfair Museum in 1951. And it has gone on to much fame as a house museum, but Miss Thomas did not want her home to be torn down or converted. She wanted it to remain a historic house museum. The Girl Scouts USA purchased the Wayne Gordon House for its National Girl Scout Program Center. Us museum people know it as the birthplace, the Juliette Gordon Low birthplace. In 1953, the house was saved from the threat of demolition when the Girl Scouts of USA purchased the birthplace and then led a major fundraising effort to support the restoration program that followed. Girls from around the world raised nickels, dimes, and dollars for Daisy, putting together bake sales, community fairs, dinners, pageants, fashion shows, and more to restore the birthplace to its original appearance. In 1955, the National Executive Director of the Girl Scouts wrote, "We are interested in restoring it in order to help the citizens of our country and particularly present to future Girl Scouts that they catch some of the fire and spirit determination of the young girl who began life within its walls and whose character was largely formed during her life there." So the Girl Scouts USA saved the birthplace and wanted to tell the story of Juliette Gordon Low, which it continues today as a premier house museum in our country. Now we've come to the founding of Historic Savannah Foundation and what we call our in-house heroines, 7 Savannah women who saved the Davenport House from the wrecking ball, and in so doing, the first effort of Historic Savannah have gone on to shepherd the preservation of our fine city. Each unique individuals, these are our 7 ladies. We do not have a picture of all 7 together. So there's 6 of them on the left. And then we've got a picture of Dickie Roebling up at the top, rounding out are the 7 women who founded Historic Savannah Foundation. What they wanted to do after the destruction of our city market in 1955 was come up with a plan to save the old city. But planning was not our forte. They needed a cause célèbre, and the cause célèbre was the impending destruction of the Davenport House. I show this slide now of one of our 7 women, just for you to understand that these were remarkable women, each individually. One of those was Lucy Barrow McIntyre, who along with raising 6 children, began the Junior League of Savannah, began the League of Women Voters. She was involved with Savannah Suffrage Organization, free lunch programs in the city. She was on the Democratic National Committee, did so much work. So just know that the Historic Savannah was just one of her many works, a well-rounded civic activist. But our leader with regard to our 7 ladies is Anna Hunter. She was a catalyst. She was the spark that brought the women together. She was the founding spark of Historic Savannah Foundation. And this is what Lee Adler, one of our premier preservationists, said about her. It was her energy, brilliance, and determination and tireless work that awakened the citizenry to the value of restoring the deteriorating buildings of the old part of Savannah. She led the way to the restoration of 1,100 irreplaceable historic architectural buildings and the awareness of their value of the squares and public spaces in what is now one of the largest National Historic Landmark districts in the nation. Her speeches and writings on the subject are not the musings of an ivory tower dreamer. She exhibited a shrewd understanding of the legal and financial aspects of such an endeavor and persuaded bankers and merchants that old Savannah was a potentially profitable asset worth preserving. So what happened was the impending destruction of the Davenport House brought all these elements together in the Gold Room of the DeSoto Hotel on June the 28th, 1955, brought a group of people together to raise the money to save the Davenport House and to initiate a Historic Savannah Foundation. And of this, Anna Hunter said, It is because of these periodic panics which landmarks are threatened that our group first initiated the idea of historic Savannah. We believed that if an organization could be founded on a sound basis, expert advice procured on what in Savannah was worthy of preservation, we could inaugurate a long-range plan and the damage of constant crises would be avoided. And so the original goals for Historic Savannah, as presented in 1968 at a speech, still sort of have resonance today. The goals at that time were to formulate a long-range program of preservation and restoration with emphasis on the original city plan, to both give and take professional advice on preservation, to survey downtown Savannah so they would know what was worth saving, what was historic and worth saving, practice practical use for saving historic buildings if they couldn't be made into homes, that how could these buildings be used, zoning measures that accepted preservation and tourism. And she said that we have been caught up in the great maelstrom of converging tides and have had to lift our sights and consider the whole area of urban planning. So our 7 ladies and Historic Savannah were interested in saving the entire city with regard to historic resources. But there was still the project of the Davenport House Museum. And the first director of Historic Savannah Foundation was the formidable Helen Nightingale McKinnon. And in the picture on the right-hand side with the big chrysanthemum corsage, cutting the ribbon with Lucy McIntyre to open the Davenport House on March the 9th, 1963, was Helen Nightingale McKinnon. Her counterpart at the Juliette Gordon-Low birthplace was Robertine McClendon, who was their first director as well. Bringing in the era of historic houses and historic sites for open to the public in Savannah. We're moving forward with regard to our Hall of Fame. In the 1960s, a group of people came together to initiate Historic Savannah's tour program. This is a quote from Historic Savannah. The genesis of Historic Savannah's tour service was a gift. Historic Savannah Foundation files contain a document from July 1971 stating Savannah's visitor services was given to Historic Savannah Foundation by its owners, Betty Rower, Franklin Traub, and Betty Lee. The threesome began their tour company in 1965 and donated it to Historic Savannah Foundation 6 years later. They were inspired by Savannah's blooming preservation enthusiasm and the potential it held for their beloved city. They researched and wrote the Sojourn in Savannah, an official guidebook and map of Historic Savannah and surrounding countryside, which became Historic Savannah's recommended guide. So they initiated the tour service and they wrote the guidebook. And from that, they hired an army of docents and interpreters and tour guides, which taught those millions of people who came to Savannah our story, and I celebrated our story to the world. We also recognize Trustees Garden Club, one of our premier garden clubs in Savannah, have worked since the beginning of the movement in the 1950s to protect the squares and parks. In 1957, working with Park and Tree and Bay Street associations, the Trustees Garden Club undertook the replanting and further development of Bay Street parks, beginning with 2 that were slated for demolition for parking lots. Working with the gas company, they relit the harbor light and gas lamps and the length of the Strand. They have done many projects. One of the most noteworthy is in 1967 with the Colonial Cemetery. The neglect of the cemetery had resulted in vandalism, broken tombstones and walkways, ailing trees and shrubs. The club did extensive research into tombstone and ironwork repair and colonial plantings before the restoration in January of 1968. With the help of the Federal Urban Beautification Grant and community backers, they were able to raise $50,000. The club was able to fund a new watering system, tabby sidewalks, lights, benches, trees, shrubs, and ground cover. The iron entrance gates were installed and trash cans, containers placed where needed. Some members themselves learned to restore the ancient brick tombs and personally undertook cleaning and repointing of the brick. So they gave money, they gave expertise, and they gave their time for the betterment of the city, particularly with regard to Colonial Cemetery and numerous other projects, including one of their many projects is the garden at the Davenport House Museum. They helped us repurchase property that had been sold away. They hired landscape designers to create our garden, and they also worked in our garden. On the lower left-hand corner, they've continued to steward our property. There's Audrey Platt actually planting our garden in the 1990s. So they've continued that relationship down to the present time. Now we have the Junior League of Savannah, who undertook the funding of an official survey of historic properties. So you got to know what you have before you can save it. They funded the publication, the first publication of Historic Savannah, an inventory of historic properties. They partnered with Historic Savannah Foundation and the Georgia Day Project, which brought school children down to the Landmark District to celebrate the past. They supported zoning ordinances, and as a consequence of all of this effort with regard to preservation, they were a model for other junior leagues around the country to support preservation. Now, the second edition of Historic Savannah Inventory was largely the work of Mary Lane Morrison. She took what the Junior League had funded earlier and documented it further. And she was recognized by SCAD as a woman of distinction because of her research, scholarship, and historic documentation of historic Savannah. She undertook the dating of all buildings surveyed in the historic district, and she used old tax records, newspapers, and deed records. She also researched individual architects, Charles Kluski, and she wrote the biography on John S. Norris, one of the architects well known in the Landmark District. She was recognized by the Georgia Trust for her outstanding achievement in the field of preservation, saying she made a major impact in documenting the architecture of Savannah. Virtually every building's date of her origin of construction was due to her work. And now we have Anne Lane, who with her husband, Mills B. Lane II, and her son, Mills B. Lane IV, are credited with a good number of preservation efforts in the east side of the Landmark District. Her husband was a banker, so so he was busy, and much of the work that they did as a couple, she actually initiated. So as you see in these two maps, the blue are the ones that were initiated by Mills B. Lane and Anne Lane. The ones in red were done by her son, Mills B. Lane IV. An example of what she did is just across the street from where I'm sitting in Columbia Square. This is the Frederick Ball House. So in the northeast quadrant of the Landmark District, they created a cluster of attractive houses that had been derelict, and to entice people to return to the downtown area. And much of their work was done and can be seen in Washington Ward, Warren Ward, and Columbia Ward. Anne Lane. A person associated with Anne Lane and Mary Lane Morrison is Claremont Lee, Georgia's first female landscape designer. And she's known with creating plans for a number of important landmark district buildings open to the public, the Owens Thomas House, the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace, Andrew Low House, and the Green Meldrum House. But she teamed up with Millsby Lane II, and a number of the buildings that he was able to save, she was able to create landscapes for them. And she renovated 4 squares, Madison, Troop, Warren, and Washington. So as you walk through the squares today, you might not know her name, but you will see the work that she did in landscape design. Laura Bell Barrow, whose family lived at Wormslow Plantation out Skidaway Road, she arranged with her family the gift of 750 acres to the Georgia Heritage Trust. She maintained her and her family's home, Wormslow. She chaired the original restoration committee at the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace. And what she did for the downtown area also was that she gave her share of the Scarborough House's ownership to a Historic Savannah Foundation when the title reverted back to the Durin heirs, and that allowed so her share was given to Historic Savannah Foundation, and Historic Savannah Foundation purchased the other shares for $45,000, and that allowed for the ownership of the Scarborough House, and it eventually became the Ships of the Sea Museum, one of our landmark preservation sites in the downtown area. One of the first presidents of Historic Savannah Foundation after its founding was Kay Cobb. I don't have a picture of Kay Cobb. That's some research we need to do, but she was involved with the commitment to restore the Scarborough House when she was president in the 70s. We have Virginia Jackson Kaya, who was an artist who was from Baltimore and came down to Savannah. Her husband was a professor at Savannah State University. But she was an artist, and for the museum people in the city, we know her name. We might not know her history, but her name goes with a staff development scholarship through the Coastal Museums Association. She believed in the perpetuation of knowledge, particularly for museum professionals. She opened a museum in her home, and her home is now a rallying cry for preservation to this day. So we recognize Virginia Jackson Kaya. Mary Helen Ray was a pioneer preservationist with regard to landscapes. She was for a dozen years the chairman of the Park and Tree Commission and fostered the rehab of squares and the preservation of trees and landscapes in the landmark district. She authored a number of books with regard to preservation of landscapes, a guide to the significant historic gardens of America, and historic preservation, a challenge to action. She was a founding member of the Savannah Tree Foundation and a pioneer in the urban forestry movement. Anne Winter Osteen. Historic Savannah Foundation had a licensing project to create fabrics and wall coverings and furniture and paint colors. And that project was Anne Winter Osteen's primarily, and she received the Davenport Trophy for this work in the 1990s. And of course, we have Emma Adler. She was everywhere with regard to historic preservation. She and her friend Robbie McClendon started the annual education project Georgia Day. She was the chairman or the president of the Junior League that produced the first historic Savannah inventory. She was a passionate advocate for Massey School to be turned into a Massey Heritage Interpretive Center, a center of learning about historic preservation and the history of the city. She initiated the effort to make Savannah listed on the World Heritage Site, did that nomination. Her entire life, along with raising her family, was committed to the preservation of Savannah. Georgia Day. So for the early part, well, for the mid 20th century to the late 20th century, most of the people that I've talked about concentrated their work on the landmark district. They were primarily interested in what we might call, quote unquote, significant structures and spaces. They were interested in civic betterment. They were hardworking women, but most of their work was done as volunteers. As we move forward in time, we are getting women that have been educated to be preservationists and to make their livings at it. And there were a few luminaries with regard to the late 20th and early 21st century. And chief among those is Beth Lartimer Ryder, who has been involved with preservation her entire life. She was, I think, began as an intern at Historic Savannah Foundation in the 70s. She became an employee of Historic Savannah Foundation. She moved on to be an independent preservation planner. And in 1979, she worked on a historic American building survey project on the Central of Georgia Railroad Complex. She did that work. She was the first director of Savannah's landmark rehabilitation project, and she worked on a number of projects to restore properties in the Victorian district and to get those recognized. She worked for the Metropolitan Planning Commission. She was the first person to be a historic preservation officer for the city of Savannah. And in that role, she undertook architectural surveys of Tybee, Thunderbolt, Ardsley Park, Thomas Square, and Gordonston. She wrote National Historic Register nominations for many city neighborhoods. She helped write the city's first bus ordinance. She wrote the archaeology ordinance, which is yet to be adopted by the city. She was the staff for the District Board of Review for many years. And she co-authored with Emma Adler the first attempt to nominate Savannah as a World Heritage Site. She has retired. I think she retired in 2016, but she continues her work in preservation as a tour company owner, Savannah Architours. And of course, the luminary of luminaries, Paula Wallace, the founder and visionary of SCAD, who at this point, I believe, have rehabbed or restored 70 or more buildings, not just in the landmark district now, but throughout much of the city. She says that today we've got ghost tours. When she arrived in Savannah in the late 70s, Savannah was a ghost town. She turned a collection of historic properties scattered through the city and the downtown into a cutting-edge arts institution, slowly acquiring and rehabilitating buildings to recreate elegantly restored classrooms, studios, and student housing. Wallace and SCAD used the past as an asset to shape the future through the buildings that they have rehabbed in Savannah. Books could be written on what Paula Wallace has done. Our city, we wonder what our city would be without SCAD. We don't want to look that way. The second generation of 7 women that have taken care of the Davenport House are the people on the screen that you see here. A group of people in Savannah undertook to raise an endowment and to reinterpret and re-restore the house in the late 1990s, early aught decade. They did this work. They worked hard, and they were recognized with a Preserve America Presidential Award in 2005 for this work. Vonette Goodwalker is works in the landmark district to this day for the past 20 years. She has spent her life correcting the omissions of the past with regard to interpretation and the story of Savannah. And she and other tour companies are helping to write the stories that have not been told and interpreting African American history. And Vonette does that through her footprints in Savannah. But she's been involved with the Tellfair Museum. She was director of the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum. She has done much work with the King Tisdale Cottage Foundation and the Beach Institute. Helen Downing, through her real estate work and rehabbing a number of buildings in the landmark district, is a luminary as well. So lots of women in our Hall of Fame and former presidents of Historic Savannah Foundation and recipients of the Davenport Trophy, which is the highest honor with regard to Historic Savannah Foundation. But there's so many more stories to tell, and time is moving forward, and stories that we really need to tell. And the quote that I spoke about earlier with regard to well-behaved women, that historian was not talking about the women that misbehaved. She was really more concerned with the silent work of ordinary women and the enrichment their lives can give to the story of our past, the American past, that we really need to look to for inspiration as we move forward. And one of the groups of women that I think we really should look to are women that did the archaeology at Irene's Mound. Now, this work took place in the late 1930s and 1940. Despite the fact that the project was run by 4 men, women made up the majority of the work and were involved with almost all aspects of the work at Irene's Mound. There were 32 white women whose names were known and 87 African American women whose names were not recorded. I think research continues to be done into who these women were, but they did every aspect of excavating and the academic work with regard to processing the work done at this archaeology site. The academic work published by the excavation would not have been made possible without the strenuous clearing and excavation carried out by African American women on the site. The project provided income for these women's families during the Great Depression through this federal program. It provided excellent pay, quote unquote, of $2.50 a day and steady work during a time of hardship. What these women did was cut steps, dug squares and trenches, removed logs and brush, excavated burial mounds and artifacts, used block and tackle, picks and shovels, wheelbarrows, brushes and tools, and doing other work once considered inappropriate for women. The women of Irene's Mound. We were recently given a clipping of the custodian of the Davenport House for over 20 years, the real preserver of our asset and our resource, a woman like Rosa Ching, and we celebrate her as a woman of preservation. And as time was moving forward and I was trying to put together this program, I talked with people, seasoned and young, and thinking about women working in preservation today and what they have been through and their work and who we recognize as preservationists today. And I talked with a woman in her early 50s, and she said when she went to SCAD, she said there weren't a lot of women in Savannah actually doing preservation. She spoke about Stephanie Churchill at Historic Savannah Foundation, who was winding down her career. And there was Emma Adler, who was focusing on Massey School, Virginia Mobley, who was an advocate, and Beth Ryder, who was working at the city. But she said, when I got out of school, there weren't very many women in preservation field, certainly none in the construction field. I went into business trying to make a living for myself, and it was a constant struggle. The men in construction did not respect my opinion as a builder or as a preservationist. we'd be talking and you'd tell them exactly what you wanted. And you'd say to yourself, am I speaking in a foreign language? Her language as a woman was so completely different than the language spoke by the construction workers that she was supervising. But she goes on to say that today it's totally different. The environment is totally different. Women are more respected. In fact, women are leaders and opening their own businesses with regard to the preservation field, not just as preservationists, but all the way up to City Hall and being respected for professionals by City Council, including the women on City Council. And yet, when I was preparing this presentation, I spoke with a young protege, a 30-something, and I told her I wanted to talk with her about being a woman in preservation. And when I spoke to her at the beginning of the conversation, she said, when I was getting ready to anticipate your phone call, I could not think of one woman. Not one woman came to my mind. All of my preservation professors were male. Though my class was largely made of women. She went on to say, when Emma Adler passed away, I cried. There will never be another Emma Adler. She used her position and her pocketbook to exact change. And people say, how could I be her? I'm so sure people say I could not do that. Where are we going to find the next one? She was a movement in herself. There will never be another Emma Adler ever. She went on to say, my young friend, there has to be a perspective shift on who we view as preservation leaders. So as I was thinking about this, and as we move forward and thinking about women of preservation, I called my colleague, the respected Melissa Jest, who has roots in Savannah and has worked for Historic Savannah Foundation, Preservation Philadelphia, the National Trust, and now she works for the state of Georgia. And I called her up and I wanted her to tell me, I wanted her to do my work for me, actually. I said, well, who are pioneers in preservation that you respect? And she told me people that were respected in other states and she was aware of that were doing monumental work, but that was not what I was interested in. I was just like, Melissa, who inspired you? And she said, Jeannie Mae Bonaparte, my mother. Now, I would prefer that you heard this story from Melissa because she can tell it with much more passion than I can, but I'm doing what I do. I'm a docent and docents tell other people's stories. I want to tell you Melissa and Jeannie Mae Bonaparte's story. Melissa's mother bought a fixer-upper in the East Side neighborhood in 1978. She needed a safe place to bring her children back. She was moving back from New York City. It, at that time, was not a safe place to raise her 3 girls, so she headed home. She bought a house in the East Side neighborhood, but she was unable to get a loan. As a Black woman without a man in the household and 3 young children, she was considered a risk. The house was in the Black neighborhood, and it was considered blight. She was too much of a risk, even though she was a certified tailor, and today she would be considered an entrepreneur. She could not get a loan. She was redlined by banks. So she had to patch together a rehab effort, small project by small project. And she bought a set of books, Time Life magazine series of home improvement. Now, those of us that were raised in the 70s recognize these books. Books on plumbing, electrical repair, and thus and such. She said, Mom saved, reused, and repaired. We patched the metal roof with tar paper. We crawled underneath the house. We fixed the floorboards. We scraped siding, patched plaster on the interior. Mom had to preserve and maintain her home, and she was proud to do that. It's a contributing structure now, but then it was home, and we had to take care of it. And we weren't the only ones. People were doing similar things all over our neighborhood. All Black folk know how to do it without standard ideas of financing restricted to us. We had to take care of what we had, one project at a time. in our neighborhoods of Kyler, Brownville, Carver Village, Ogeechiton, Battery Park, etc. White's abandoned homes once integration happened, and that was the time that allowed us to create our own communities and to maintain our own properties. We had to make do and to create a home for ourselves. So what she says is makes a lot of sense. Take care of what is mine. That is the essence of preservation. There are a lot of fancy nomenclature with regard to preservation. The first step is to value what is yours. The next step is to take care of that, and that makes you a preservationist. Keep on taking care of your property. And once you've identified what's valuable and what's important, keep telling these stories. Even though the past is difficult, tell these stories and appreciate these family stories and the preservation that goes along with them. Keep history alive. So my interpretation of that is to tell your mother's story. And tell your story. And this is Melissa's current story with regard to preservation. She was able to acquire her grandmother's house, and it's in East Side neighborhood, and it has been neglected for 30 years, occupied, but not maintained. And it was put on the blight list and slapped with a number of code violations. It's her property now, but she could not fix 30 years of neglect in 30 days. And the property was targeted by an anonymous concerned citizen, and the power was shut off. What she said was it was a domino effect of negative assumptions, and nobody was engaging the owner. No one was engaging her. And so she appealed to the code enforcement inspector. And finally, she was able to make the connection between herself, her home, and her family's story with the code inspector, and was able to get them to work with her because she's doing this work out of pocket, with the realization that this is a family story. This is not blight. This is investment in the community. And so she's able now to continue this work on this home and revitalize a house that will be again, a contributing structure to the neighborhood once completed. So again, what she's saying is listen to your mother, and this gave me a chance to put my mother here. But if you want to be remembered, you have to tell your story and you have to write your history. And so in thinking about this, we've got young people who may not know whose shoulders they are standing on with regard to preservation. And lots of young people now are going to college and they're majoring in history or related humanities discipline, and somebody's saying to them, what you going to do with that history degree? And you might be given a pie chart like this that shows you how you can make a living, if you can make a living with your passion, and the types of jobs that are out there, or maybe out there prior to the pandemic, let's hope they're still there. Jobs in museums and advocacy and downtown revitalization and regulatory compliance. So people trying to make a living, quite different from the early preservationists who were doing it for civic betterment. Now people are trying to make a living doing preservation and like fields. And there are lots of young people out there, again, who do not probably know whose shoulders they're standing on, but they are standing on them nonetheless. And these are young people who are working in construction, in rehabilitation, tax credits, all kinds of avenues for becoming preservationists and working professionals in the preservation field today. So what I think is important for us to continue to do or start to do is valuing all this work, valuing the work of volunteers and donors, partners, employees, employers, teachers, value the work of docents that has gone before and that's happening now. And then if you're at a certain stage in your life and you've got some experience, you've got a story to tell, you have to tell it. You have to be a mentor. You have to, if you want your story to be perpetuated, if you want your resources to be maintained, mentor young people. And this is just a sampling of the people that we mentor at the Davenport House Museum through our docent program, through our junior interpreter program, through our internship program, through hiring people. We tell our story in hopes that it will have a life beyond our years and have a legacy. And I think that's a story that all of the preservation women before us would appreciate. Tell the young people and mentor them, and we will have a future. So let's remember our quote. The history of all times and of today especially teaches that women will be forgotten if they forget to think about themselves. So let's tell our story. That's what I'm doing now, and that's what I hope you'll do in the future.
Great, Jamie. I have to say, I certainly chuckled when you said, what are you going to do with that preservation degree? Because I was asked that many times, but I have a job, so that's all good. I love Melissa Jeff's story and the circle of life with that preservation brings with it. It's certainly people that are concerned about sustainability and the environment. Preservation is, that's what preservation is all about. I made a couple of notes while you were talking about things that your presentation tied in with our with the archives. I thought I might mention there's some collections that tie into things you talked about. The notebooks from the Historic Savannah survey, we're partnering with Historic Savannah to digitize those and make them public. So we've got a few up. We're still working on that, but if people are interested in accessing those Historic Savannah inventory notebooks, they can go to savannahga.gov/digital collections. Also, Mary Lane Morrison, when she was dating buildings in her survey, she used the City Tax Digest and assessments, and we've got those in the city archives if people are interested in trying to research their homes and work and preserve their homes. We have records, including those and other permitting things. So if somebody's interested in the history of their home as they work to preserve it, we can help them. Also, we did a great program with Deborah Johnson Simon on Virginia Kaya's history. So if you're interested in watching another Hungry for History program on Virginia Kaya, that would be really a good one to watch. Virginia Kaya was a fascinating woman. So I think this is a great addition. Women's history is certainly history we need to be paying more attention to, and I think this is a great way to inspire our next generation of women and preservationists. So thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. We will see you next month for another Hungry for History. Have a good one.